Oh, man. Oh, why you didn't wake me up, man? Tell me I was supposed to record. Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys for stopping by. So as you guys know, we have the candidates tournament going on right now. So round two. This is the last player that I have not covered yet. So I'll see what I'm gonna do tomorrow. But we have Richárd Rapport versus Alireza Firouzja. Firouzja has to play black for a second time. But it's a pretty nice game. It has, some nice features in it, of course. So for all of my people that are coming from the Philippines, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, so I will say mabuhay, magandang umaga, magandang hapon for anybody who might be seeing this in the afternoon. I appreciate you guys for stopping by. Anybody who is from Hungary, I will say Sia, Kusanem. I appreciate you guys for stopping by. Anybody who is from France, I will say bonjour. Comment ça va? Comment allez-vous, mes amis? I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Merci beaucoup. Anybody who is from France or from Iran or who does speak Farsi, I will say salam to you. And Khayli Mamnoon for stopping by. Also, merci to you. There's quite a bit of French in the country. If you guys are ready to go, let's take a look, see what we have for this game. So we do have E4 rolling. We have C5, so we have the Sicilian defense. So I'm kind of happy because I haven't covered a lot of Sicilians, on my page. It's not a lot that Wesley So gets into this. So we do see knight to F3. We got D6, C4, pawn takes D4, and then there's two main moves in this position. Knight takes D4, queen takes D4. Queen takes D4 is not a bad move by any means. It is much rarely played. You are wanting to take with the knight more than likely because you're going to be looking at knight to C6 and attacking your queen pretty much straight out the gate. But it is a nice little sideline if you want to try to step off the main path and go on to something a little bit less played. Knight takes D4 has almost 100,000 games in the database. So, like I said, it is very, very heavily played. So we do see queen takes D4, and then, of course, we see knight to C6. We see bishop to B5. You literally either have to pin that knight or you have to move the queen. There are no other options because this queen is hit by knight to C6. We do see A6 asking a question to the bishop. The bishop does take on C6. Pawn takes C6, and then we do have the move C4. And we kind of have like a little Maroczy bind setup going on. As you guys know, C4 and E4 is a Maroczy bind type situation. So we are just trying to discourage the movement of D5 as much as possible. So we do see the move E5. And then the queen goes down to D3. And I will say the thing that is very challenging with the move queen takes D4 is the fact that if you don't play this Maroczy bind situation, when you do throw E5 to attack the queen, the queen has like so many different places that it can go. Retreating and stuff like that. So it's a little bit difficult to like remember all of the different, nuances as far as the queen retreating because, they have to be treated pretty differently. So like I said, we do see this. We see A5, the queen goes down to D3. And then we do have the move knight to E7. And as early as it is in the game, I actually have a pause the video section right now. If you do want to pause the video and see what this isn't the absolute only move, but it is the best possible move in the position. See what Richárd Rapport finds to play in this position. Okay, so I think a majority of people, which, like I said, it's not a bad. There are a few different moves. I mean, there's knight to A3, there's knight to C3, there's castles here. It pretty much makes everything pretty even. But the definite most aggressive move to play in the position is what Rapport played in the game, and that is the move C5. It looks kind of strange, probably because you're like, why am I moving this pawn a second time? Didn't I try to establish this little Maroczy bind situation? I need to get my king out of the center, bro. And that is all very true. But C5 has very legitimate reasons why it is played. What we actually see in the game, instead of capturing on C5, we see knight to G6. But if we back up, if we do see the pawn taking C5, this would actually be pretty crushing for white. Not completely winning, but this is a much, much better position for white. Of course, we're going to take on d8 with the queen. Force the king over, only move. And then the knight is going to take e5. And the problem is you have a fork coming here. And you also have this pawn that's kind of under attack. So you're pretty much either going to have to go bishop to e6 or king over here. Of course, this knight is holding this pawn here. But as you can see, black now does not have the ability to castle. And they have some things to worry about. And they have some unraveling to do before they're developing their pieces. So we do not want to go into that. So like I said, Firouzja did get into this position right here. And then so we take pawn takes d6 because our queen, you know, is not the most comfortable on d3 with that pawn being captured. And also e5 is covered now with this knight to g6 move. So all those little tactics we just saw aren't really involved now. So pawn takes d6, queen takes d6, queen takes d6. And then we do see bishop taking d6. And then we have bishop to e3. And that is the novelty of the game. White's focus, one of White's focuses is this pawn right here. It is the weakest pawn in black's position. This pawn is protected by the bishop and the rook. This pawn is protected by this knight and this bishop. And if need be, you know, f6, just super protecting it. This pawn doesn't have any of that protection. It really needs to be pushed down. Or this pawn needs to be pushed and this rook brought down to, you know, give it some assistance. Or maybe the bishop come in here, stuff like that. But, I mean, you have castles and you have this rook swinging over. You know, you are going to be putting a lot of pressure on that pawn. So we do see the move a5. So we are prepared to meet the attacking of the pawn with a rook to a6. We got castles by white. We got f6, like I said, just making sure everything is solid in the central part of the board. Rook does come to c1, and now we have that decision to make. So we do see rook down to a6. We see knight b to d2. We see bishop to e6. Knight comes down to e1. We see king over to f7, and knight comes up to d3. So one of the things, you know, whenever you are playing against an isolated pawn or a backward pawn or, you know, any type of weak pawn in your opponent's position, you want to control the square that's directly in front of it. So basically what white is trying to do is make sure that they defend this square c5. They do not want this pawn to be pushing, because if you loaded up all of your pieces to try to attack a square and that pawn gets pushed, that normally messes everything up that you're trying to do against that pawn. Now you have to redirect your pieces back around and try to get, you know, another position set up. So as you can see, this bishop, this knight, and this rook are all focused on this square, making sure that black cannot push this pawn. They would have to try to swing the rook over, but even then, you still cannot push this pawn because you have too many pieces defending c5. So the first thing you need to do is stop the pawn from moving. And then the second thing is create a plan to try to get rid of that pawn. Doubling, you know, maybe playing a3 and doubling rooks on this c5 would be a really nice start to that, because like I said, I mean, this pawn is somewhat under defended in this particular situation. So we do see a rook over to d8. We are playing against, you know, these under defended pieces over here, especially this knight on d3. We do see king over to f1, recognizing that your knight is going to come under fire in a minute. We need to get this king into a better position. Bishop does come to b4, and then we do see king to e2, and the king is now just in time to make sure that, you know, we have gotten our stuff protected. So we do see knight to h4, you know, we're just trying to tickle this pawn. You know, we're trying to see if white doesn't care about its pawns, and it's just giving them away for free, like, you know, free giveaway pawn day. And so knight takes b4, we got pawn taking b4, and then we do have the move g3, and so pretty much the knight just has to kind of retreat. Doesn't really have anywhere to go. So the knight does come to g6. We see bishop to c5, redirecting our focus and trying to get a different pawn now. The rook does come to b8, and now we kind of have a problem on a3. You know, there's something that we need to do with this pawn because it is attacked by the bishop and the rook. So we do push a3, and pawn takes a3, rook takes a3, and you don't necessarily want to take with the rook because you're going to be taken back with the bishop. And not only is the bishop like on a good diagonal, but this rook is now discovering an attack on this pawn. So it is giving white a lot of what they want. So we do see rook b to a8. We see knight up to c4. And then we do see bishop taking c4, rook taking c4, and then we do see knight back to f8, and then we have the move knight to b3. Now, there is something to be said about rook taking a6 in this position, because after the rook takes, the king is going to come up to d3, and this is a fairly active position for white to be in. You're not worried about any checks on this rank right here, and if this rook does attack this pawn, you have the ability to push it. This bishop is doing a good job of holding the one weak pawn that you have in your position, or I mean, you know, the first weak pawn, I'll say. So, you know, you definitely are in a really great position now. But like I said, we do see rook to b3. We see knight over to e6. A rook goes up to b7 with check. The king goes back to g8. We see bishop down to e3. The position is pretty open, so we really don't want to give up that bishop. We want to kind of hold on to it. So we do see rook to d8. We got f4. Knight goes to d4. And, you know, we're kind of in a little bit of a pickle, so we kind of need to give away the bishop now. Bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4, and then we do have king over to d2. We do not want to allow this rook to penetrate and be able to come behind the king. So that's why we are moving king to d2. The rook does come down anyway, so we go ahead and grab that pawn on c6. The rook comes over to h1. We see rook c to c7, and this is actually looking like pretty deadly for white. So the rook does take h2 with check. We see the king up to d3. We got g6. We see the move e5. And I mean, just starting to check is possible as well. And then we do, like I said, we do see e5, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5. We see rook up to h3, and we do see king up to e4. The rook takes on g3. Of course, we're grabbing some pawns, but we are going to get these pawns back as white, because those two pawns, or those two rooks on the 7th, are completely deadly. Rook takes rook goes to g7 with check. The king goes over to h8. Rook takes h7 with check. The king goes over to g8. We see king over to f4. Let's tickle this rook a little bit real quick, see what it wants to do. The rook goes over to e3. Nice little anchor square with that pawn. Rook b goes to g7 with check. The king goes to f8. We see rook to f7 with check. The king goes to g8. We see rook f back to g7. The king goes back to f8. And we're thinking maybe we might be getting into a repetition. But after we see the move rook to f7 with check, king goes to g8. Now we see the other rook coming over to check on g7. The king hides over in the corner, h8. And then we do take on g6. And I mean, Rapport is feeling like he has like a superior position. He has these rooks like right on this king. He has this pawn right here. And so he has definitely some possibilities. So he is looking really good. The rook does come to e2. We see e6 because, I mean, we got a pass pawn, so let's push it. We do see a rook over to e8. The rook goes to h6 with check. The king goes to g8, only move. We do see a rook to g6 with check. The king goes back over to h8. And then we see rook f to f6. This is a very, very important pawn in our position. So we need to make sure that we protect it. And this rook doesn't really want to capture this pawn because that's going to actually allow our king to get into the situation and, you know, protect this pawn further and allow it to push again. So that is why we don't see this b2 pawn being taken. We do see the move rook to e7. And there is actually, we have come to a point in the game. Did I do that twice? I did. So I got a double guess the move. I didn't even realize that. We have another point in the game that white has a really nice move that they can play in this position. And it's very, very tough to defend. There is very little defense that black has. So if you want to pause the video and guess what Rapport, what type of winning type of move Rapport has in this position, go ahead and do so. Okay. I kind of gave you a hint a little bit earlier talking about this king, you know, kind of penetrating, getting up this way. The main issue with this position for black is that their rooks are not connected. Their rooks are a little bit defensive. And the fact that these rooks are not connected, it makes it a little bit hard for, you know, black to cut white off completely. Like white has black cut off completely. Basically, I mean, white is literally shuffling between these two squares. And white has a lot more movability. So the move in the position, if you guessed it correctly, is actually king to f5. And there is not a lot that white really has the ability to do or black has the ability to do in this position to, you know, discredit this move right here. There are two moves that are like the most logical moves, and there's another move that I'll talk about. The first move, even though it seems kind of weird, like why would I move this rook, is actually rook over to b7. You are attacking this pawn. You are still holding this square, so you don't really have anything to worry about. But, you know, you have the ability to play rook to f7, but you have the ability to check on f2. But this does allow the king to do what it wants to do. After you move to e4, the rook can take on, rook f can take f7, pawn takes f7, rook takes f7, and then the king takes d4. And this is a very promising position because those of you that are familiar with rook endgames, this has the opportunity to get into the Lucena position. As you guys know, that is the key to all rook endgames. You know, this rook will be coming down behind initially. This rook is going to try to stop it. You know, this king is going to try to get into the action and stuff like that. And most likely you are going to get into the Lucena position. And this should be winnable by white. So backing up, after we move the king to f5, you did have the ability to say, man, I'm just going to go ahead and start pushing this pawn, dude. I'm going to start trying to do that. And, you know, try to get my own queen rolling, right? Well, we have the move rook to g3. Idea is trying to come behind this pawn and make sure it doesn't push any further. But it's also, you're also threatening some checks on this H file. So after we see the move d2, the rook would go to h6 with check. The rook would go to h7 only move. Rook takes f7 with h7 with check. The king takes h7, and then the rook does slide over to d3. The king would come over to g7. We'd see b4. The king would go to f8. We would see b5. The king would go to e7. Rook would go to d7 with check. King up to e8, and then rook down to d4. And the crazy thing is, I mean, black is holding this position. This is pretty fairly even. There really isn't a great way to make progress for either side. You know, you can't push this pawn. You can't push this pawn. You know, and probably black is going to push this pawn to clear the way so he can move his rook behind this pawn and just trade everything off. And it's going to be a draw on the rook endgame. So that is how you want to try to play. But after the king comes to f5, if you think I'm going to go ahead and just come behind and check, this will be absolutely winning for white because, like I said, this is allowing white to get into the position that they want. King going over to e5, a rook coming over to e2 a check, and then a king coming up to d6. And like I said, the problem is these rooks are not connected with each other. So this king has the ability to just swing over here and, you know, start to attack this rook. And now this rook doesn't really have, you know, the best, you know, way to go. I mean, you're probably going to go to rook to b7, but, you know, you can push pawn. I mean, you can do so many different things in this particular position. So like I said, you know, black has to play a specific way. So he has to find that d3 idea for this not to be completely winning for white. But backing up in the game, we do see rook to e7. From here, and then we did see the move b4, so this was something that was not caught by report. We do see the move d3, a rook goes down to g3, you know, the same similar types of ideas. So as you guys can see, when you get into certain positions, I mean, you know, you have like very similar ideas that come up in all of these different positions. We do see d2, rook goes to h6 with check, rook goes to h7, rook takes h7, king takes h7, and then we do have rook to d3. And so you see that we have a pretty similar position from what we saw before. So the king came to g6. We see king down to f3. Rook takes e6, rook takes d2, and then we have king to f6. The king comes up to f4. The rook goes down to e1. The rook comes up to d4, and then the king goes over to e6. The problem is this, you're going to be able to come behind this pawn. So it's going to be really hard to push. If you ever give up cutting the king off this way, this king is going to come over and pretty much camp out on b8 or b7 and just stop that pawn. So it's similar to the position that I showed you guys in another video yesterday where we were over on the g file. So it's pretty much that in reverse. So that is that game. I appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. So maraming salamat, aking makaibigan kusanem, merci beaucoup, and khayli mamnoon, and I will see everybody next time.